Hello and welcome to the Jensen Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. I just want to give you all a quick reminder that Jensen Center as an organization is supported by donors. And we would ask that if you enjoy the work that we do, you have benefited from the things that we do with Jensen Center as an organization, that you would consider becoming a regular contributor, or you can contribute a one-time gift as well. That would be very helpful for us, and we really appreciate any support you can give. You can go to jensencenter.org, go to our donate page, and find different ways to give to us there. It is all very much appreciated, and we really do benefit from any gifts that you give us so we can continue to produce the content that we produce. Now, we are going to be continuing again with our Christology series. We have been looking at the development of modern Christology in the 20th century. This is the third program on the 20th century. And I guess as we're doing this, we are... I didn't know how many programs it would take me to get through the material, so I didn't know it would be three. But I guess it's a neat division because we have the first, second, and third quest for the historical Jesus that kind of begin all of these, or bracket the different parts of this. And we had the summary of the first quest in the first one with Albert Schweitzer, that we had the second quest last time, and now we're going to talk about the third quest for the historical Jesus. And so we are going to be continuing talking about the third quest for the historical Jesus following the second quest. And then after that, the second part of this is that we are going to be looking at some of the other Post-Barthian thinkers. So we looked at Karl Barth's influential theology, how that relates to Christology, the critique that he's a Christomonist. And then we began to talk about the Christology of the Post-Barthians. We started with Jürgen Moltmann last time. We're going to talk about Jensen and Pannenberg this time. If we have time, we'll talk a little bit about Karl Barth as well, but I'm not sure if we're going to get to that or not. So we'll start then with the third quest for the historical Jesus. Now, just a quick reminder of where we've been in the past with our quest for the historical Jesus overview to get you caught up if you don't remember. It's been a while since you've watched or listened to that. You had the first quest for the historical Jesus, which was based on the assumption that there is a difference between the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith. So that this is a critical assumption for those who don't believe that the gospel stories or gospel narratives are actually fully historical or divinely inspired. It's argued that the Christians have this doctrine of Jesus that is really the product of the development of Christian theology. That's the Christ of faith. But the Christ of history, the actual historical person of Jesus, is something very different from that. And so these quests for the historical Jesus are attempts of scholars and historians to try to put together exactly who the historical Jesus was to differentiate him from the Jesus that is worshipped and taught by Christians like myself. And in the first quest, you had a number of totally different pictures or portrayals of Jesus who tended to have the ideology identical with whoever was the one that happened to be writing that history of the life of Jesus. A lot of these early lives of Jesus were basically taking miraculous events as recorded in the Gospels and then trying to make them natural events. So saying, well, the events really happened, but they weren't supernatural, they were just natural. That's at least some of the lives, or many of the lives that were developed. That kind of ends then with William Reed and Albert Schweitzer putting forth a picture of Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet, as one who saw himself as a prophet calling forth the end times. This was largely due to these scholars trying to place Jesus within the context of first century Judaism. So you have this new emphasis on what it is that Jews in the first century believed, trying to put Jesus more so in his Jewish context, rather than looking at him as some kind of vague moral teacher and trying to place him in a post-Enlightenment Western context. So they're trying to place him in his own historical context and say we need to see Jesus in his own terms instead of seeing Jesus as just like us or having the same views that perhaps we would have. That leads then to the second quest for the historical Jesus. Well, I guess first you have this gap. You had the no quest time period. You have people like Rudolf Bultmann saying, really, all we can know about Jesus is that he lived and taught some things and died. And that's basically it. And then you have this rise in the post-Bultmann world of New Testament scholarship. You had Caseman and Bornkamm trying to argue that we can know more about the life of Jesus. They would say that the majority of the sayings in the life of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels are probably not historical. However, some of the things are historical, and we have this distinct set of criteria that we can use to talk about the probability of these things actually having been said by Jesus. Okay, that's where we're at here. Now we get to what is called the third quest for the historical Jesus. So now we're looking later into the 20th century, and this is something like the Jesus Seminar. If you've heard about the Jesus Seminar, Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan are probably the two most well-known figures. They've been talking heads on all sorts of, History Channel things. As you know, the History Channel is very good about their history. It's always wild stuff on there, but those two in particular had gotten some media exposure. Been interviewed on NPR, on Fresh Air, or whatever, and so they've had a significant cultural impact. Now, if you know anything about the Jesus Seminar, they have a set of criteria that they set forth to say this thing really happened. Is this saying of Jesus valid or is it not? And then they take a vote on it to try to put together what they think is the most probable actual historical reality of the life of Jesus. Well, let's talk about some things that are going on that lead to then this third quest for the historical Jesus. One of those things is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and if you're not familiar at all with the Dead Sea Scrolls, essentially they are a series of documents that were kind of stumbled upon in a cave that are part of the Qumran community, which is basically there are these different communities within ancient Judaism. Particularly, we're talking about the Essenes. These are individuals who had a kind of separatistic movement, kind of like what you think of as a kind of monasticism, though the parallel isn't exact. But essentially, we found a series of these scrolls, these texts, and the texts include portions of the Old Testament, but they also include some other additional texts as well. You also had the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text, the Nag Hammadi library. So this is a time where, throughout the 20th century, there are a lot more archaeological discoveries. We're finding more textual discoveries of things that we didn't know existed before. A large part of this is just due to the arid climate. In a drier climate, you are able to preserve texts in a way that you couldn't in a other kind of climate. So, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, in some ways, honestly, they've been exaggerated in terms of their importance. I guess there's just, you think of Da Vinci Code stuff and a lot of sensationalism around some of these discoveries. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were certainly very important for our understanding of Judaism in the first century. Of course, they're from a particular sect, so it doesn't tell you everything about first century Judaism by any means. But it's not as kind of world-changing paradigmatically as some would probably seem to think that they were. But nonetheless, the Dead Sea Scrolls are important. There is now a new focus in scholarship on the theology of Second Temple Judaism. And when we use the phrase Second Temple Judaism, we're talking about, the Judaism of the Second Temple. So we've got Solomon's Temple, and then we've got the rebuilt temple. Largely, we're talking about that period between the end of the Old Testament and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So we're talking about Judaism in the time of Jesus. Now, you may think we've got all of these documents that tell us all about exactly what Judaism was like in the first century. The reality is we really don't. We do have documents. We have a lot of documents before the time of the New Testament and then after. It's not that easy to just construct a total clear picture of exactly what was going on in Judaism in the first century. It's not like we have tons of treatises of a bunch of Pharisees. We have, we've got texts there's debate about dates. We have texts from certain groups, 200 years before the life of Jesus. And then we have things that were, sayings that are, put together, say in the Babylonian Talmud, but it's hard to always trace back how far the sayings go, how much of it is a response to the rise of Christianity and to the destruction of the temple. So there's a lot of scholarship dealing with Second Temple Judaism, trying to outline what was going on in the first century Judaism. But this becomes a distinctive field of scholarship that grows significantly all throughout the 20th century. So if you're familiar with Pauline scholarship, you probably know about E.P. Sanders' book on Second Temple Judaism, where he argues for covenantal nomism as a proper soteriological framework to understand Second Temple Judaism, in that the covenantal nomism being the idea that the Jews believed we're in the covenant with God by grace, but essentially we remain in that covenant through obedience. And that's just one part of an example of how this has affected scholarship. So as the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, as people are looking further into Second Temple Judaism, you have the Nag Hammadi texts. Archaeology begins to grow as a field. People are starting to ask questions of, well, how does this affect what we know about the actual life of Jesus? How does this affect what we know about or the conclusions that people came to prior to this in their quest for the historical life of Jesus? So some of this, as I mentioned, does come from archaeology, particularly the archaeology in Israel that points to what was going on in the social life of ancient Israel. So aspects of archaeology point to things about the social life of Jesus. And to be clear, not all of those archaeological findings are just used by critics like the Jesus Seminar. These are helpful to us as well as those, myself as one who believes in the inspiration, infallibility of the New Testament texts and the historicity of the gospel accounts. Yeah, some of this historical context and archaeological context can be very helpful for placing Jesus into historical context. So that's helpful for everybody. But you would see how this would be used in a particular way with those who are trying to reconstruct the historical life of Jesus and put his ministry within a first century context. So the development of historical Jesus scholarship has increasingly, from that end of the first quest with Reed and then Schweitzer, which kind of ended with bringing Judaism into the picture, that's only grown. The influence of understanding Jesus in his Jewish context has just grown, especially as we've grown in our knowledge of Judaism of his time. So the third quest, it's not as easy to put an exact date on it like we were able to with, say, the second quest, where we had the date of 1953 to 1970. The third quest kind of overlaps in some ways with the second quest, but the third quest, the criteria that are there in the third quest grows throughout the 1980s. So there's not a clear date, but we're talking 1970s, 1980s largely. Some of the things related to the third quest start even as early as the 1960s, which is why I said there's kind of an overlap between second and third quest for the historical Jesus. So it might not be that easy to kind of put a line from here when this one stops and this other one begins. It's not like there was where there's first quest, big gap, second quest. So kind of they blur together a little bit. So the goal of this third quest of Jesus, there's two goals here. Right? One is to apply the findings that have been the case in studies of Second Temple Judaism and archaeology to the life of Jesus. And the second is to come up with a more systematic set of criteria in order to judge whether or not the sayings of Jesus are validly historical or whether they were developed later. And as we looked at the first quest, there weren't any clear sets of criteria. Each person who's developing their own life of Jesus kind of has different criteria that they use in order to construct who they believe Jesus to have historically been. The second quest you have with Caseman, and then Borncom, some criteria that are established then. And here you get the development of a little more of that. So let's talk about what some of the additional criteria are that they're looking at. So the first of these is the contextual judgment. So it's certain aspects of the life of Jesus are admitted as historical. So by nearly everybody. So pretty much everybody believes certain things by the time we get to this point. And there are very few things that people agree on, but we could have a few, okay? So the one is Jesus lived, the first. The second point is there was some conflict with the Pharisees. Pretty much everybody's agreeing there. Third is Jesus did some teaching. Fourth, most people think Jesus was claimed as some kind of miracle worker or power over demons to some degree in some way. That was at least claimed about Jesus, regardless of whether what people think Jesus claimed about himself in terms of messianic consciousness or not. And then the fifth point is basically that Jesus died. So those points are pretty much accepted universally across the board, but that's pretty much all you have. So the thing is, like, you get all of this scholarship, you get all these people writing all these texts and arguing, writing articles and books and dissertations, and you really end up with not much of a consensus conclusion at all at that point. So the contextual judgment here, the first criteria, is based on the particular fact that is agreed upon that Jesus is rejected by the Jewish people and that he is executed. So that means that as you're looking at the validity of the sayings of Jesus in this model, you're going to look at the sayings and ask, would this saying lead to that scenario? So the sayings of Jesus that are most probably historical in their judgment are going to be those particular sayings of Jesus which lead to the conclusion of his being rejected and executed. So a lot of his debates with the Pharisees, right, claims he makes against the Pharisees, those kind of things are probably more likely historical than some of the other things because they lead to what is the accepted historical conclusion. So if they make sense with what is the accepted historical conclusion, they're more likely to be seen as historical. They're not definitive proof that it's historical, but that's one of the many criteria that is being looked at. Does it fit with the overall picture of what we know of history in that Jesus is executed, especially with what we know about Judaism in the first century and Roman law? Okay. The second is historical plausibility. And here is where there is an increased emphasis on what we know about Second Temple Judaism. So historical plausibility is, we're asking the question, does it fit what is a plausible historical context in that part of the world in that time? Are the consequences of that particular event, saying, parable, whatever, consistent with what we know otherwise of the historical context? So if things don't seem to fit with the historical context, if things don't seem to fit with what we know, say, about the Pharisees as they're portrayed, or Roman law, or whatever it might be, then they would say we can reject that and say it's probably not historical because it doesn't have that plausibility in terms of the kinds of things and events and conclusions that we find in this time. Then we have the third principle here, which is congruence. Does it fit with other established historical events and ideas? So basically, you're using the broader historical context around the Gospels as primary, and you're saying what we know about these other historical texts and contexts is true, and then you're saying, and the Gospels kind of have to be subsumed under that to say where the Gospels agree with these other historical texts, they're true, and where they don't, they're not. So there very much is an assumption underneath this that the Gospels are not historical texts, right? The starting assumption is the other texts are more reliable, and what the Gospels tell us about first century Judaism are not our primary place to go. They are a less reliable source for our understanding of first century Judaism than any of these other texts, even though they really give us a bigger picture of first century Judaism than anything else we have. But there's a starting assumption that the Gospels are not reliable that becomes kind of programmatic in the entire movement. So that everything else is the assumption that those things are probably more accurate than the Gospels are. So we judge them by all of the other texts that we have. So what's the result of this third quest? Do we have now a third quest gospel that's been put together that shows us all of the probable life and sayings of Jesus all together in one text? No. There is no unified picture at all. So that's the reality. Like, nobody agrees on anything. So we've had this third quest for the historical Jesus. Now we have much more rigorous criteria. We've been developing this for many decades. And what do we come out with is nothing. I mean, we have nothing more concrete than what you had in the first place. Everybody disagrees. So the fact is, every scholar has their own picture of the historical life and purposes of Jesus. And, even though these scholars, they're now more historically conscious than the first quest, I don't think you come up with a conclusion that's really that much different from what Schweitzer said in the first place, which is, to some degree, they do, even though they're more sensitive to the historical context, the picture of Jesus that they ultimately come away with is still kind of the picture that they want to have. Like the criteria are not quite as so rigorous as to make it clear that this is a historical Jesus versus, a Jesus that is just the construction of the ideas of the individual who is saying those things. Okay, so what you end up with at the end of this quest is really no firm conclusions at all. Just a couple things to say in response to kind of where this ended in more recent scholarship. So that's with someone like, if you look at Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Now we're getting into 21st century here, so I'm going a little beyond this the time. But Richard Bauckham has done a really good job of challenging a lot of these assumptions. Richard Bauckham and Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and that book has been hugely influential. Not everybody agrees with all of the conclusions in that book. In fact, I don't know anybody that necessarily agrees with every conclusion except for Richard Bauckham himself, because there are some uniquenesses of his conclusions on certain points. But he tries to make the argument, essentially, that the Gospels are based largely on eyewitness testimony. So what he's doing is taking apart this notion that you have a kind of story that's just developed by the church, and then you get these kind of names that are attached afterwards to these kind of preconceived or developed narratives. But he tries to make the argument, essentially, that there are these eyewitnesses in different locations that have had encounters with Jesus, and they are going around telling people about their encounters with Jesus. And so the Gospels actually include these eyewitness accounts as a significant factor in the development of the Gospels themselves. So Richard Bauckham's work is really good, I think. I think he's really excellent. His written work is good. I've heard him in some debates, and he's not as good when he's speaking. He's not as compelling when he's in that kind of format. Like, he's done some stuff with Unbelievable. I would really recommend reading him, just because some people communicate much better in writing, I think, than they do when they're speaking, and I think Bauckham is the case. And I don't mean to insult him by any means. I just think his arguments are more powerful than you'd think by just listening to him. I think really you have to read his text to see the strength of his arguments. So Bauckham has now shifted scholarship a lot, that now there are renewed debates surrounding the relationship between eyewitness testimony and what's written in the Gospels. Then you have someone like N.T. Wright. Now, N.T. Wright, I have plenty of criticisms of N.T. Wright on significant issues. There's plenty of things I like about N.T. Wright quite a bit. N.T. Wright is one who, his book on the resurrection of the Son of God, so it's called The Resurrection of the Son of God. It's a really excellent work. I don't agree with everything that he says there. There are conclusions that I disagree with. But I think overall it stands as a very strong historical apologetic argument for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus and of the reliability of the gospel narratives themselves. So in more recent years, we've seen some British scholars, those are the two that stand out, but there are others as well, that have really done some heavy lifting in defending the historicity of the gospel accounts against these quests for the historical Jesus. Now, you do today have a small group of the Jesus mythicists. Okay, so you've got the Jesus mythicists that all the people involved in the quest for the historical Jesus reject. These are those who still try to say that Jesus never existed, that the narrative of Jesus was likely taken from, some kind of pagan sources, and it was a conglomeration of all of these different mythologies all kind of smushed together, which would really be incredible that the apostles would, or whoever wrote the Gospels in their accounts, would have such a profound knowledge of so much mythology from all over the world, from all different time periods, and all able to collate all of this. It was kind of amazing. So you have what's his name, Robert Price is one, and Richard Carrier, but these guys are not viewed as really reputable scholarly resources. So someone like Bart Ehrman has been highly critical of them, and Bart Ehrman is basically a professional critic of Christianity. So Bart Ehrman's got, obviously I disagree profoundly with Bart Ehrman in almost everything, but Bart Ehrman, even as a scholar who is a critic of Christianity for a living, he defends the historicity of Jesus against these accounts. So you get the Jesus mythicists. They're always a fringe group, and they're always going to pop up here and there, and they're always going to get a following of some kind because it's just sensationalism. But they're not taken very seriously in historical scholarship by really anybody, and that is similarly the case today. They're really strong on rhetoric, but not much else. So if you followed any of those discussions, you probably know that. All right, so there we are in terms of historical Jesus scholarship, and that brings us up to where we are in the modern day on those particular issues. All right, so now we move on from looking at the historical Jesus questions back to our questions of systematic theology. So we began by we looked at Rudolf Bultmann and Karl Barth. We spoke about Barth's Christocentrism. He is bringing Christology really once again back to the center of Christian theology, to see Christian theology as primarily the event of the revelation of God in Christ through the kerygma, or the proclamation. The Word of God is being primarily revealed in Christ in his own person. This is a move away from Protestant liberalism in its kind of moralistic leanings in someone like Albert Ritschl, or this just kind of feeling of dependence upon the other that you find in someone like Schleiermacher. And then moving on from Barth's Christocentrism, we then had the birth of Post-Barthianism. The first figure we looked at, and they're all overlapping figures in terms of their years. They're all writing at the same time. But we looked first at Jürgen Moltmann and his two works that are primarily two works that are highly influential in the development of Post-Barthian theology, his Theology of Hope, and his book on the cross, so the crucified God. So you have the Theology of Hope and the crucified God defining a Christian theology that is where God is defined by his future, and particularly God is defined by the cross. So the cross in some way defines God as he is. So just to reiterate what we've called that particular view of looking at God's being, we've talked about it as actualism. So the actualism being the idea that God's act determines his being. Okay, so this notion that the divine economy, so we have a distinction in theology proper between ontology and economy. Ontology being God's own eternal being as he is in himself. Economy is how God works out redemption in history. Classical theology says that the economy flows out of ontology. So that God is in his eternal being, reveals himself and works through the economy. But what the economy changes is not God himself, but us in our relationship to God. And it changes the world, doesn't change God. However, this is reversed for the actualists. So they say that the ontology, the nature of God's being, is actually determined by the economy. So the economy changes God, so that it's kind of reversed, so that the ontology is defined by economy rather than economy being defined by ontology, which is how classical theology would say it. As we talked about with Karl Barth, there are debates as to whether he was an actualist or how much of an actualist he was. So act determines being is what actualism means. But the Post-Barthians then start to they take the actualist interpretation of Barth and they go farther and develop Barth's ideas in that actualist direction. So this is where it affects Christology really profoundly, is Christology is not only the question of how God in ontology reveals himself in the economy and the incarnation, but now we're talking about the incarnation and life of Christ as an event which determines God's own eternal being. So there we are with some of those issues. Okay. So we're going to look at a couple other figures involved in what we're calling Post-Barthianism. It's Moltmann's term. I think, and I mentioned four main figures. Okay, so we talked about Jürgen Moltmann, Wolfhart Pannenberg, Robert Jenson, and Karl Barth. Those are the main figures that we're talking about as this kind of Post-Barthian movement. Now, they're not all identical in their ideas, but they do work a lot. Colin Gunton would be another figure. I could totally add Colin Gunton in here. He as a fifth figure that would be worth talking about, and Paul Hinlick in some ways as well. But we got to limit ourselves. Okay, so these are the four I'm talking about. But these figures, though they differ on many points, they're all in the same general milieu. They share this inheritance of Barth and moving beyond Barth in moving into that actualistic direction. So we're going to talk first. We've got Wolfhart Pannenberg, and Wolfhart Pannenberg's years are 1928 to 2014. So he died pretty recently at this point. Now, Wolfhart Pannenberg comes primarily from a Lutheran context. He was actually raised. He was secular when he was a child, and he did have a conversion experience. You can read about his, conversion experience, and he is, he's German, so he is largely in a Lutheran context. And the thing I like about Pannenberg, he's not an easy read by any means, but the thing I really like about Pannenberg is that he reads the Lutheran Orthodox and he does take them very seriously. So in Pannenberg, you're going to have a lot of interaction with Johann Gerhard, or Abraham Kalov shows up quite a bit. He's very well read within Lutheran Orthodoxy, and he does take those thinkers seriously, as much as he disagrees with those thinkers on some fundamental issues. Now, obviously, I'm in the Lutheran Orthodox camp, so that's where I'm at. But I do appreciate that Pannenberg is willing to not just dismiss them. So if you read someone like Ferde, and I'm always picking on Ferde, but okay, that's just what I do. So he doesn't really interact seriously with these figures. He just kind of dismisses them. He's got these kind of trite ways of dismissing these profound thinkers. Pannenberg really wrestles with their arguments, and he wrestles with them well. He disagrees with them, but he really does take them seriously as thinkers. So Pannenberg and Jensen's the same way. Pannenberg and Jensen, I have an immense amount of intellectual respect for, though I profoundly disagree with many of their conclusions, which is very different from how I look at a Gerhard Ferde, because I don't have an immense amount of intellectual respect for him either, because I don't think he really wrestles. I think he just dismisses people, and I don't think he really wrestles with their argumentation significantly. But that's absolutely not the case with these individuals I'm looking at here. So they are individuals who, again, I profoundly disagree with their conclusions and their doctrine of God especially, but they are ideas that are worth wrestling with and interacting with. Okay, so he comes from a Lutheran context. He's well read in Lutheran Orthodoxy. He initially is a Barthian. He studies under Karl Barth, and he loves Karl Barth. He reads the entirety of the Church Dogmatics before he starts his dissertation, which is kind of a crazy thing to do. I mean, I haven't read through the entirety of the Church Dogmatics. I've gotten through close to half, and I gave up because I just don't know that I want to spend much more time in Barth than I have. But it is not easy to read through the Church Dogmatics, and Pannenberg just he thinks that he's got to read the whole thing to impress Barth, which is kind of wild. So it tells you the kind of guy he is. He's very well read, very intelligent. So he reads the entirety of the Church Dogmatics to study under Barth. He's initially pretty compelled by Barth's system, because again, Barth is able to, Pannenberg has this real conversion experience. He has, in some ways, what you may call an evangelical faith. So he's not interested in just like a historical, critical Protestant liberalism or something. He's really interested in his encounter experience with Christ and wants to explore that. But as an intellect, he is not. I think as intellect as more intelligent people, you have to do this, but he is committed to. He believes in the historical, critical conclusions. In other words, he doesn't believe in the total authority of all of the words of Scripture. So Barth, for him, kind of logically makes sense for a place for him to fit. And I think you see this with a lot of people in the 20th century, is Barth gives an option for people to feel like they're being intellectually respectable in the academy, but able to hold on to some kind of evangelical faith in a broad sense. But after a while, in Pannenberg's study, he begins to reject that Barthian label. And though he has profound respect for Barth, he is a student. Pannenberg is a much better philosopher than Barth is. Pannenberg has some pretty brilliant philosophical texts. So he has a book called The Metaphysics and Idea of God, for example, which is a really wonderful work of philosophy. So he's much more philosophically oriented than Karl Barth was. And it's not to say that Barth didn't know his philosophy. But Pannenberg is much more favorable toward the discipline of philosophy. And Barth, like Kierkegaard, he was drawn more toward kind of existential thinkers, and with his dialectical theology, that all kind of makes sense. Pannenberg is reading a lot more of the analytic philosophers, so more rigorous, systematic philosophical tradition. And we talked about Karl Barth denied that God could be known outside of Christ. And what he means by that is he's rejecting natural theology. So he doesn't believe that there is a realm for any kind of natural theology where you can make a reasoned argument for the divine existence of God based on natural reason. For Barth, instead, that God is only known through his direct revelation in Christ. I think there are philosophical reasons for that. I think Barth can't overcome that divide that's essentially there in Kant. That noumenal-phenomenal divide. I think Barth is very much an adherent of a lot of kind of post-Kantianism that's just kind of in the air at that time, though probably not too self-consciously so, not as much as someone like Bultmann would have been, where you have this divide between nature and supernature that God has to occasionally kind of come through it, and Christ does that. So Christ is the kind of direct revelation of the noumenal into the phenomenal realm through encounter. So with that kind of divorce, you can't really have a natural theology because those two realms are kind of cut off from one another. And I think that's what you have in Barth. But Pannenberg is not so skeptical of natural theology in quite the same way. Now, to be clear, when Pannenberg talks natural theology, he is not talking about the classical, more Platonic or Aristotelian Thomistic proofs for the divine existence. He has other ways philosophically of having a kind of natural theology. And in that book, Metaphysics and the Idea of God, he gets into some of that. But he basically, he has an understanding of the kind of sensus divinitatis that's in John Calvin. So this kind of inner sense of the divine, the sense of God. So he sees natural theology not so much as a rational argument from... Though he's going to make historical arguments, but he's not going to see it so much as a rational argument from, the particular to the universal, like a Platonist would, which is, I think, what Paul does in Romans 1. But he's instead going to draw on what is that inherent natural knowledge of God, that there is this kind of search for and longing for meaning and purpose and desire that humans have, that is the sense of the divine that can only really be fulfilled in Christ, in Christianity. So Pannenberg is going to talk about a kind of natural theology, but only in that sense. Now, among the Lutheran Orthodox, you have two senses of natural theology. And whereas Aquinas basically only has that you reasoning from your experience of in intellect to the existence of God, from your experience of creation or nature, from reason. The Lutheran Orthodox and the Reformed Orthodox scholastics are going to do the same thing. They're going to divide that into a kind of a twofold natural theology. There's the inherent natural theology, and there's the derived natural theology. So the inherent is what's in the inner person, and that is things like the sense of the divine that Calvin talks about. But then they're going to have that derivative natural theology is from rational argumentation. So they're going to grab onto both Thomas and this internal sense. Now you have people like Van Til who just grab onto that internal sense and reject the rest. And I know that he's not against proofs, and I shouldn't have even gone there because I'm going to get critiques of that, but oh well. But then you have Pannenberg, who also similarly, kind of like Van Til, really just draws on that internal sense of the divine. So he's only going to have that internal sense of natural theology, not that derived natural theology that you have in the scholastics. All right, so that's what he does with natural theology. So he rejects that. So he's not going to say that Christ is the sole revelation of God in the sense that it's only through that kerygma proclamation that we have any knowledge of God. He's going to say, no, there is something inherent internal. There is a kind of natural theology in a way that we can have. We can use philosophy in the development of our theology. So he reincorporates both philosophy and history into theology. So whereas Barth has these... He wants to kind of have these circles that almost never touch between, as we said, history, which is kind of the meaning in history, and actual history, as we talk about. They kind of maybe overlap, but don't quite, and depends on what statement of Barth you read, because he seems to contradict himself at different points. So I don't know, but Pannenberg, wants to more self-consciously bring history back into theology as well. So he's saying we need to have theology, and I think some of this is because of the influence of the Lutheran Orthodox on Pannenberg, that he's wanting to say, well, he's not buying into the entirety of their system. He is wanting to say history is really important and philosophy is important, and we can incorporate these things into theology. But he wants to do it in a modern way rather than in reliance just on classical philosophy, which is more where I'm more reliant, much more on classical philosophy. Not that I would say that there's no benefit to analytic philosophy in any way or something. I'm not saying that. But okay, so he develops his own kind of theology of hope. Sometimes the term theology of hope is used to categorize all these guys writing in the 1960s. And so you'll find older articles where it's just called the theology of hope, talking about all of these guys. So we're talking about post-Barthianism. There is this emphasis on eschatology that you find in Pannenberg that you also have in Moltmann. It doesn't mean it's exactly the same in Pannenberg, but they're all eschatologically oriented. And people like Pannenberg and Jensen, they understand the importance of metaphysics in theology. So they want to bring in the philosophy of metaphysics, understanding of kind of the basic elements of reality, of being or ontology. They understand that that's important for theology, whereas a lot of the old Protestant liberals were just throwing out metaphysics altogether. But they tend to be not classical in their metaphysic, but they tend to be more Hegelian in their metaphysic, which means that whereas classical metaphysics says that God is eternal in that he is apart from time, God is atemporal, he does not exist within the confines of time, he is unchanging, unchangeable, mutable. They would say that Hegel's philosophy instead says that ultimate reality is not that which is unchanging. So there's a basic assumption in like Plato that the highest reality is the reality that's unchanging. Whereas Christian theologians coming from a more Platonic perspective, which is where I would come from on my doctrine of God, is to say that God is unchanging. He's the ultimate reality and he does not change. He exists in this eternal now. Whereas where Hegel is going to say that actually history is in this kind of process of self-development. And so where we look at the ultimate reality is not above and apart from time, but the end of time is the future, where time is going. So these thinkers, when they're more influenced by Hegel, are going to think of God in terms of his future being the ultimate reality rather than his atemporality or his existing outside of time. So he believes, like Hegel, that history is this kind of process of the unfolding of God's Spirit. What this means, though, is that like Hegel, he is going to take history seriously. He is, and this is a critique of a lot of more platonically influenced theology, and you hear this critique very popularly that classical philosophy was too indebted to Plato, where there's this realm totally above history, whereas the Bible is a real historical book that's all about history. And I disagree with that critique of classical, maybe Neoplatonic Christian theology, like someone like Augustine. But the good thing about the Hegelians is they're really taking history very seriously to say history really is the realm of revelation, which is true. But where they go beyond where a classical Christian theology would go is to say that it's not just the unfolding process of revelation, but it's the unfolding process of God's being. So you see this shift again from ontology, from economy now being read back into ontology. So that history is not just progressive in that it's God progressively reveals himself, because certainly there's progress to history in some sense, not in the Marxist sense, but in the sense that God progressively reveals more about himself and that there is a telos of history. Right? There is a real end. There is a goal in history. History is not just, in the Greeks believed that history was just kind of cyclical. The same events just happen over and over and over and over and over again. The Christian view of history says that history is actually moving towards something. There is an unfolding. There's a goal in all of history, and that's what we're leading on toward. And Hegel is very Christian in that sense, in that he is looking toward a telos, toward an end. So Pannenberg is going to say then that history it's the place where God actually unfolds his own self and actualizes himself in some way. But history is then the realm of revelation. Here, this is a big break from Barth, that history is the realm of revelation. And this is a big break from Kant. And this is where all kind of Kantian theology, and Barth never overcame this, has this real problem with trying to see how it possibly could be that God reveals himself in history. So instead of history, God has to break through that kind of noumenal realm to just kind of come through personal encounter to me. But it's not really in history. It's in my personal history. So Bultmann does this with like history and eschatology. He's going to talk about how, I come kind of to the end of myself and God encounters me in my personal history, but not history. It's personal history because it's just through encounter. And Pannenberg is now saying, no, actually history itself is the realm of revelation. That's a massive break from Kant. So Pannenberg is going much farther toward what is a historical Christian view of history and the value of history and revelation. So history becomes the realm of revelation, not just personal history, but actual real history in the world. But here is where things get weird, okay, in Pannenberg. And that is his notion of prolepsis. And this comes from the metaphysical assumption that the past is defined by the telos. So the present and the past are defined by the future. Everything is defined by what it is going to be, what its end is. Okay. So take that basic principle, and in some way you can say like, oh, well, there's something to that in Christian theology, in that, like Paul says to the Colossians, like, set your mind on where Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father, like, because you are there, right? I am defining my life now by where I will be, because in a way I'm already seated in the heavenlies with Christ, because that's where I'm going to be. So in a way, like, I am defined now by what I'm going to be in some sense. So you could see that. So there's some truth to this, but for Pannenberg, this is not just true of redemptive history, but it's true of God himself. So here is where you get this idea of Christ's divinity as being determined by his own resurrection. So whereas the resurrection, we would say, this is kind of Pannenberg is clear about the historicity of the resurrection, by the way. I mean, sometimes he sounds like an evangelical Christian apologist talking about the resurrection. I mean, he has strong historical arguments. He uses historical evidences for the eyewitnesses of the resurrection. So he takes the resurrection very seriously. But in order to take the resurrection seriously, he starts to define God's own being by the resurrection. And this is where he goes way off in terms of a classical approach, where I would say he goes way off. So that the resurrection for Pannenberg is not merely a revelation of God, but it actually determines who he is. Essentially, the resurrection does not just reveal the divinity of the Son, but it constitutes the divinity of the Son. So that Jesus is God because he rose from the dead. Now, this sounds like the heresy of adoptionism. This has been considered a Christological heresy. At times, Pannenberg is kind of like, yeah, I am an adoptionist, but he defines it a little differently, too, that he's also equal with the Father in his being. Because he is saying that because everything is defined by his future, the fact that Jesus is defined as God by the resurrection also means that he's always divine. So in some way, he's proleptically divine always because of this event of the resurrection. So it constitutes, this event in history constitutes the divinity of the Son for eternity. So it's not that the Son became divine and wasn't before, but the Son is always divine because of the resurrection. It sounds odd, it sounds very bizarre, but it makes sense within the metaphysical system, because if everything is defined by its future, you can define the divinity of the Son by his future. Now, I think the whole metaphysical system is wrong, and I think it's very confusing and convoluted, and I don't know how you preach this kind of thing very well, because I think it's very, very confusing, and for someone who's maybe steeped in Hegelian philosophy, it kind of makes sense, but is this applicable or practical to the average person? So I think this has very serious consequences for your doctrine of God, for your doctrine of Christ, and just for how the heck you even preach this. So Pannenberg then, in terms of his Christology, he has a book called Jesus, God, and Man. There's a division in Christology, debate in Christology, over how it is that you approach your Christology. Do you approach your Christology from below or from above? So a Christology from above says we start with the divinity of Jesus, and we move on from there, and then we talk about the historical life of Jesus, but we begin with his divinity. Christology from below says we start with the historical person of Jesus. Now, Christology from below is not really something that people are that interested in the kind of Barthian, Post-Barthian world, because that's, again, this historical Jesus stuff, and we don't really have any access to that, so we just kind of ignore that and talk about the Christ of faith. Pannenberg says, no, we have to talk about real history. Christology from below. We start with our Christology from below. So that's how we start his Christology. That's a pretty big shift for the development of Christology. Economy determines ontology is the next point I have here. So that's what we've already discussed. So that in this book, he defends this notion that the being of God is determined by the economy, particularly by the resurrection of Jesus. He is non-Chalcedonian. All these guys reject Chalcedon. He's going to say, I don't reject Chalcedon in that it affirms that Jesus is fully God and fully man. He's going to say, I completely affirm that. But what he's really rejecting is the metaphysic. He rejects classical metaphysics and thinks that there are better ways now to talk about the unity of the divine and human in Jesus than what are the classical philosophical distinctions between two essences. A human essence and a divine essence coming together in a singular hypostasis. So he departs from Chalcedonian Christology. Now, I don't think there's any significantly good reason to depart from Chalcedonian Christology. I, in fact, think that the classical doctrines and classical metaphysics answer a lot more questions than the modern ones have. But in some ways, Pannenberg has tried to overcome some of the problems of that post-Kantian theology that have plagued us for so long, but he's not willing to come the classical route. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think that I appreciate that he wants to talk about history and metaphysics. He's right to do that. But Hegelian philosophy just doesn't answer all of the questions that need to be answered in the right way. And I just don't think there's significant reason to depart from what the classical categories are. I think there's a reason why providentially God brought forth the Christian proclamation within the milieu of ancient Rome, because I think all the categories that were developed there at that time period were much better ways to express the realities of Christian revelation than any modern ones can lay claim to. All right, so then we're going to talk briefly here, because I know we're almost out of time, about Robert Jenson. So Robert Jenson, his years are 1930 to 2017. Robert Jenson is probably the most significant Lutheran theologian of the certainly of the latter half of the 20th century. It's been said by some that he is the most brilliant American theologian since Jonathan Edwards. That very well may be true. Jensen is very brilliant. I think he's theologically wrong in a lot of profound ways, but he is brilliant, and it's undoubted that he's brilliant. He wrote significant sections of that, what was the ELCA's systematic theology. It's just called Christian Dogmatics. I'm looking at it on my shelf to remember what it's called. It is just called Christian Dogmatics. 2 volumes, but he also wrote his own systematic theology, which was 2 volumes. He's largely known for ecumenical work. He was involved in starting Pro Ecclesia. He's been very involved with ecumenical things with Roman Catholicism. He's considered a kind of high church Lutheran in a lot of ways, which I certainly would be, but Jensen is that in a different way. But he's certainly a writer that is always challenging and puts forth ideas that are worth wrestling with. So he studied at Luther College and at Luther Seminary. He is influenced by philosophers, theologians, and historical critics. So he is committed to the historical critical method. He actually is later he teaches at Luther College, and he was in significant debates because some of the professors at Luther College were more classically Lutheran Orthodox, and Jensen was not. And so he was in significant debates himself, defending his acceptance of historical critical approaches. He's influenced by philosophy. He had been reading philosophy significantly. He also read a lot of Lutheran Orthodoxy. So, like Pannenberg, he read a lot of the Lutheran Orthodox. But he's also reading Kant, he's reading Hegel, Kierkegaard. He's influenced by them as well. So his influences are really varied, and you see this in his writings. He kind of draws from all over the place. He draws a lot from Jonathan Edwards. He draws significantly from Aquinas, even though he rejects kind of the heart of his system metaphysically. But he has a profound respect for Aquinas, and some of that is probably due to his ecumenical work. He is initially Barthian. He writes his dissertation on Barth, which is not surprising. These guys are all we put him in the Post-Barthian category. So he reads Barth, and he very much takes that kind of actualist interpretation of Karl Barth that we have been talking about. All right, so he's a historical critic, but he is largely Barthian. He's an actualist. So where does he go with his Christology? Well, Jensen, like the other figures we've mentioned here, adopts several of the historical critical conclusions with regard to the historicity of the sayings and teachings of Jesus. So he, like many of the people we've talked about here, believes that much of what is recorded in the Gospels is unhistorical, that it is, instead of, he would say it was theologically true, but the things that are attributed to the mouth of Jesus many of them were probably not actually spoken by Jesus in any way at all. So he buys into the historical critical methodology and the non-historical nature of much of the Gospels, though many other parts of the Gospels you're going to say are historical. He has a kind of process theology that's influenced by Hegel, just like Pannenberg and Moltmann do. He does quote Hegel quite a bit, but he very firmly rejects the idea that he is just a Hegelian. So he would say he's not a Hegelian, but he kind of is. Even if he pushes against it, I don't know how you get Jensen without Hegel. I think he's a Hegelian. And that doesn't mean he adopts everything Hegel says, but I think it's very clear that there's a strong influence there, even if he wants to push back against that a little bit. So he very much temporalizes God. And this is a major theme in Jensen's writings, that he very much sets in opposition classical Greek philosophy and a Jewish or Hebraic approach to God, where he says that the Greeks had very different questions than the Hebrews had when they were talking about metaphysics than the Hebrews had when they were talking about God, because essentially the essence of the Hebrew question is a question of identity. Who are we and who is God? And the Greeks were asking, what is our relationship to the chaos of time? So Greeks come up with this idea of the ultimate reality being atemporal, being something that is static and unchanging in the midst of the changing nature and chaotic nature of time. There has to be this greater reality that is unchanging and eternal. Whereas the Hebrews are more concerned about identity. Who are we? Who is God? How do I identify God? And he sets these two things very much against one another. So he adopts a form of the Hellenization thesis, which says that early Christian theology starts to bring aspects of pagan Greek thought into line with their theology, and Jensen sees that as a mistake. He speaks about Greek philosophy as pagan theology. He essentially says it's all theology, it's just pagan theology versus Hebraic theology. So while he doesn't totally reject natural theology, he is going to reject any notion of a kind of neutrality in like Greek philosophy. So he says instead and this is where it kind of sounds like Van Til, actually. Not that either of them would want to say that they sound like the other, but it does sound a little similar. So he, like Pannenberg, is an actualist. He is going to say that the cross and resurrection are central to God's own identity. He speaks about God, and he asks a question like, how do we define God? And he says, God is whoever raised Jesus from the dead. So what he wants to do is make, in the Old Testament he says, who is God? God is whoever brought the Israelites out from Egypt. He wants to identify God with his redemptive activity. Now, in terms of like epistemology, if we're asking how is it that we know God, I think Jensen's exactly right. As a Christian, how do I know God? As he's the one who brought Jesus back from the dead. I think that's a good answer. But the question is, does that define God's eternal being? Or is that just how I know God? In terms of identity, Jensen goes beyond that idea of me just knowing God through that by saying that defines God in some way. You see this in Jensen's rejection of the logos asarkos. He's got a little essay on this about the logos asarkos, meaning the Son apart from the flesh, which is the pre-incarnate state. He essentially says there is no pre-existent logos. There is no pre-incarnate state. That's a pretty significant departure from classical Christology. Again, he's strongly anti-Hellenist, strongly anti-Greek. He very much affirms this notion that God suffers, that God changes with us, that God exists within time. At some points, he actually says God is time, so that at one point he identifies the Father with the past, the Son with the present, and the Spirit with the future. So God is future to himself. The Holy Spirit is the future of God. And this isn't on Trinitarian theology, this is on Christology, so I won't get too into that, and we're also just about out of time. So he denies Chalcedonian Christology in its classical sense of a pre-existent logos uniting with the human nature in the hypostatic union. However, he is going to confess that that the Son is fully human and fully divine. So he does believe in the full humanity and full divinity of Christ. But he's not going to confess it in those classical categories, certainly not with an unchanging divine nature. So like Moltmann and Pannenberg, he's going to reject, though he's going to try to affirm, like they all do, the fullness of the deity and fullness of the humanity and full personhood of Christ, going to reject the categories used in Chalcedonian Christology. Now, here is where Jensen understands that the resurrection is really important, but when he actually talks about the question of whether there was an empty tomb, he doesn't seem to think it matters, which is kind of the whole point. I think he's unwilling to even say that the raised body of Jesus is physical. He has his own way of describing what a body is, because he says, well, a body is where someone is present. What is a body in the first place? So if Jesus is present in the church and the church is his body, he doesn't really need to have a physical body that's raised because we are his body. So we can affirm a real resurrection without talking about the physical body. And he does weird things with the sacrament in this way as well. Jensen is a very unique theologian, and same with Pannenberg. Moltmann has people that are kind of Moltmannian in some way. Jensen and Pannenberg aren't really the same way. They don't have a school of thought. They're very unique in their ideas, and they don't leave there are a lot of students of theirs that are influenced by their ideas, but there aren't like a lot of Jensonians or Pannenbergians in the same way you would have Barthians. With Moltmann, you have a little more of that. Well, that is then the end of our overview of 20th century. Briefly touched on 21st century Christology and who some of the major thinkers are. Overview of the quest for the historical Jesus. Now we've done 3 of these, so you get a broad grasp on what's happened in Christology in the last 100 years or so. So thank you so much for watching and or listening. Make sure that you subscribe on YouTube and on your podcast app. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.